Welcome back, everyone. This is Ars Divina, the podcast on the connection between theology and art. I'm your host, Corey Dixon, and I'm here with my friend Serge Danielson-Francois, and we're discussing T.S. Eliot's poem Ash Wednesday. And this second episode, we'll be discussing part two. So,
Excited that we made the escape together out of stanza one, out of part one, sorry. And here in part two, I remember when we were talking about this, I said it's not the Virgin Mary, right? You sort of could be fooled that the person that you are encountering in Lady in that first verse of part two is the Virgin, but it's not. It's someone who honors the Virgin in meditation. That becomes clear about midway through.
yeah.
But what I really love about this is just sort of the clash of images. And so, if I may, I'd like to read the long stanza that opens part two.
Yeah, please do.
Lady, lady, three white leopards sat under a juniper tree in the cool of the day, having fed to satiety on my legs, my heart, my liver, and that which had been contained in the hollow round of my skull. And God said, "Shall these bones live? Shall these bones live?" And that which had been contained in the bones, which were already dry, said, chirping, because of the goodness of this lady, and because of her loveliness, and because she honors the Virgin in meditation, we shine with brightness. And I, who am here dissembled, proffer my deeds to oblivion and my love to posterity of the desert and the fruit of the gourd. It is this which recovers my guts, the strings of my eyes, the indigestible portions which the leopards reject. The lady is withdrawn in a white gown to contemplation in a white gown. Let the whiteness of bones atone to forgetfulness. There is no life in them. As I am forgotten and would be forgotten, so I would forget. Thus devoted, concentrated in purpose, and God said, prophecy to the wind only, for only the wind will listen. And the bones sang chirping with the burden of the grasshopper. And what I love about this is, as I said, there is a violent set of images that begin this stanza. That's not the part that I like. What I like is the fact that something is recovered. The guts, the string of the eyes, the indigestible portions, they're recovered. And they're recovered by an act of faith, which is almost an act of faith in silence. This lady that is present, um, she is present as a witness to his recovery. And there's something in here that says death is not the end of the story. So Ezekiel is what comes through for me, the valley of the dry bones. Shall these bones live? Prophecy to the wind. I think the echoes of Ezekiel are unmistakable in stanza one of part two.
Yes, I agree. I think this was quite definitively that Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel, where the people of God are being put back together. In this case, the person of God this is the beginning of him being formed back together. And both cases, so he's evoking not just he's using that clear imagery, biblical imagery, to evoke that same sense that there's a restoration happening here, and this is the beginning of it. We didn't see anything like that in the previous part. The previous part had it was just in the doldrums, the pit of despair, and now we're starting to see. Although, as you've mentioned, it starts with such violent destruction and stuff like that. I had mentioned I don't really know if this is where he's coming from, but when we talked before, I'd mentioned this the three white leopards strike me almost as like apocalyptic imagery in that way. It's kind of like the beasts coming out. But I mean, they're not so strange as those usually are, but there's that sort of like beast attacking kind of thing that there's sort of the doom. But I mean, if we look to Revelation, Revelation has all these this moments of despair with destruction and stuff like that. But then there's also the new Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth, and right. So it's ultimately with the restoration. So the apocalyptic imagery, if that is what he's trying to use here, still brings in that same sense of restoration coming
I'm glad you
ultimately.
brought up Revelation and the idea that we're still looking for a lady crowned in stars, right? That's what we're hoping for. That's not the lady that we have. We have this lady who pays reverence to the Virgin, and what we get on the other side of the grasshopper chirping is a kind of a litany of Loretto is what I called it, but it's not the actual litany of Loretto in that we don't have the untire of knots. Instead, we are tied up in knots as we read the contradictions, the paradoxes. And so, if I may, I'll read that part. Lady of
Please,
silences, calm and distressed, torn and most whole, rose of memory, rose of forgetfulness, exhausted and life-giving, worried, reposeful, the single rose is now the garden where all loves end, terminate torment of love unsatisfied, the greater torment of love satisfied, end of the endless journey to no end, conclusion of all that is inconclusible, speech without word, word of no speech, grace to the mother for the garden where all love ends. And so, as I said, we're tied up in knots, like within this litany, and we keep having to deal with two images juxtaposed, love and death, and the it's not the end, it's not the conclusion of it. And we're taken to the garden, which I remember when we spoke, your first thought was the Garden of Eden. My first thought was the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think both are here in this second stanza.
yeah. I mean, Eliot has been doing this throughout the poem, and he continues to do it throughout the poem. But this is a particularly powerful example of just great writing through the use of contrast of um, overturning expectations by pairing dissimilar things and making us forcing us to reconcile how those in what way those two can be held in conjunction. So it pulls tension into there. Um, and so I'm getting the sense as I think through this more that like just about the way the path to forgiveness. There's a calmness and a peacefulness that comes with a satisfying aspect of forgiveness, but there's also this terrifying aspect of having to wrestle with the very sins that one does. I mean, this is why the church always speaks about reconciliation as this wonderful sacrament that cleanses you of your sins, and yet no one ever wants to go because they don't want to have to speak out to the priest. I don't want him knowing what I've done or whatever and stuff like that, because there's so that very tension in the reconciliation we're seeing through these he's evoking through these paradoxes and contradictions that he's using here.
Agreed. And I think that by the time we turn um, to the third stanza, where we're under the juniper tree, um, we are in a place that's different than the place where we ended the first portion of this poem. I'm going to go ahead and just add this. Under a juniper tree, the bones sang, scattered and shining. We are glad to be scattered. We did little good to each other. Under a tree in the cool of the day, with the blessing of sand, forgetting themselves and each other, united in the quiet of the desert. This is the land which ye shall divide by lot, and neither division nor unity matters. This is the land. We have our inheritance. And so, if Exodus was the imagery that we were able to hang on to in part one, we've kind of made it to the doorstep of the promised land, of this place where beloved community might be a possibility, but we aren't there yet. We did little good to each other under a tree. And I love the fact that you remembered the cool of the day and God walking through the garden. And you and I know how this Genesis story ends. It's not a good, this is not the happy ending. It comes later, but here there's a brokenness that we have to really reckon with. And that I think is why this is the land which ye shall divide by lot, there's a kind of implicit violence to the division by lot of the land. Neither division nor unity matters because we have our inheritance, and that inheritance includes the sins passed down from generation to generation. I think that's where Eliot remains honest.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think that cool of the evening strikes me too because yeah, I mean, there's the peacefulness because that's where the walk was originally supposed to be happening, is that God would walk every day in the cool of the evening with Adam and Eve. But then the time when it's actually mentioned, with a reference to that this is a habitual thing, is when they're not present, when they're hiding, when they're shamed. There's that tension again. There's the not wanting to do that. And so the that quiet of the desert then speaks not just to Exodus, but also to being cast out of Eden there. And almost, when we taught together, and you're well aware that one of my big points that I would teach to my students was about liminality and that between state, and that wilderness in the Bible, wilderness is often desert, right? In European folk tales, wilderness is the woods, but in any way that becomes that symbol of the that between period where you're going out and trying to figure out what you're doing here. We have that in Exodus as they are no longer the people in Egypt, and yet not quite the people in the promised land yet. They're changing over in that state, and there might be a way of seeing it also in God's casting Adam and Eve out of Eden, not so much as a strictly punitive, as in to bring suffering upon them, but to force them out and to grow up and to change, to reconcile with how they've been, so that they are ultimately able to come back into that garden again.
I think there's one thing that I'm seeing that I hadn't seen before as a result of thinking through what you've just said around Adam and Eve being cast out, and that's this blessing of sand. And I think I've always wondered, like, why sand? Why the blessing of sand? And I think of the the near stoning of a woman who is accused of being a prostitute. And you have a number of men who've come and they've told Jesus, well, like, does it not say in the Bible that we should stone her? And he just kneels down and makes some sort of image in the sand. And they get, as he is doing this, that in order for them to accuse her, they must also accuse themselves as the ones with whom this sin may have been committed. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And he turns to her and he says, where have they all gone? They've left. Well, then I can't condemn you. It's kind of a blessing that he gives her, a reentry into community. And that is where I think that sand for me. I mean, it's a great thing about poetry is it's open to multiple points of connection. But after hearing you bring up Adam and Eve, I'm wondering whether Eliot means to tie us just a little bit more firmly into the gospel narratives that touch on that same sort of sexual transgression. Or at least perceived sexual transgression.
Sure, and that, so the blessing of the sand becomes almost making a sacrament of it, in that way of in the same way we bless the water, we bless the oil and stuff before we use them, or when we're going to use them in order to bless people. Here, maybe that drawing is in a sense Jesus' blessing of the sand in order to um, sacralize her in this act of forgiveness.
This is, I think, the right place for us to say it gets even more exciting in the next episode when we get to 3.
So, right. So I look forward to joining you, Serge, and having our viewers join us as we get through part 3 of T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday.